What would you do if the world had taken everything from you? If, at 19 years old, you were left with nothing but the clothes on your back, a handful of coins, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second shadow? For Pearl Aldridge in the unforgiving Nevada Territory of 1884, this wasn't a question. It was the dust in her throat and the ache in her bones. She had been cast out, disowned by the family that took her in after her father's death, all because she refused to marry a man twice her age. So she paid $2, nearly everything she had, for a deed to a place no one wanted, a derelict blacksmith's forge, abandoned and rotting on the edge of a town that had already decided she was a fool. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten place, buried in the heart of the very thing that defined it, was a secret that would not only rewrite her future, but the town's entire history. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of iron, integrity, and the enduring value of what is dismissed. Pearl Aldridge arrived in the town of Red Pine under a sky the color of a faded bruise. She stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her movements stiff from the long journey. She carried a single carpet bag that held all her worldly possessions, a change of clothes, her father's worn leather-bound journal of smithing techniques, and a small tin box with $17 inside. The wind that swept down from the high desert plateau was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and bitter sage. It felt like a warning. She had lost her father to a fever 6 months prior, and with him the warmth and purpose of their small but thriving smithy. He had been her world, a man whose strength was measured not just in the muscles of his arms, but in the quiet kindness of his eyes. After his passing, her aunt and uncle, her only remaining family, saw her not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a burden to be traded. Her refusal to be sold into a loveless marriage had been met with a slammed door and a single final word, "Go," and so she had gone. She walked through the main street of Red Pine, a single artery of dust and commerce, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked tired and temporary. Men on the boardwalk of the saloon stopped their talking to watch her pass, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal. She felt their eyes like a physical weight, another layer of exhaustion on her shoulders. She was young, alone, and visibly without means, a combination that made her vulnerable in a place like this. Her face, smudged with the dust of the road, was set in a mask of stoic resolve, a look she'd learned from her father when facing a piece of stubborn, unyielding iron. She ignored the whispers and the stares. Her focus narrowed to a single, desperate task, finding shelter before her meager funds evaporated completely. She needed a roof, any roof, and a place where she could begin to piece her life back together, even if she had no idea what those pieces might look like. The town felt indifferent, a collection of hard people carved from a hard land, and she knew she could expect no charity here. Whatever she was to become, she would have to build it herself, with her own 2 hands. The thought was terrifying, but beneath the fear was a flicker of something else, a familiar spark her father had so often praised. It was the stubborn fire of the forge. She found her way to the land office, a cramped room that smelled of stale tobacco and brittle paper. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man with a slick, self-satisfied smile and a vest that strained at the buttons. His name was Silas Croft, and he was, as she would soon learn, a man who owned or had a stake in nearly everything in Red Pine. He looked up from his ledger, his eyes taking in her worn dress and the weary set of her shoulders. "Help you?" he asked, his tones suggesting he doubted it. Pearl straightened, forcing a confidence she did not feel. "I'm looking for a place to buy something small." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Buy, little lady. Property in Red Pine requires capital." "You got capital?" He leaned back, making a show of sizing her up. Pearl's hand instinctively went to the small bulge of coins in her pocket. "I have some," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The man Croft let out a short, humorless laugh. He shuffled through a stack of deeds on his desk, his movements theatrical. Well, let's see what we can find for a woman of your considerable means. He pulled out a single, yellowed piece of paper and slid it across the desk. There is one property, he said, his smile widening. The old smithy, edge of town, been sitting empty for 5 years, ever since the last smith had the good sense to drink himself into an early grave. He named the price with a flourish, as if announcing a grand joke. $2, cash. The price was an insult, a clear signal of the property's worthlessness. A functioning forge, even a small one, was the lifeblood of a frontier town. One abandoned for so long was considered not just useless but cursed, a place of failure and bad luck. Pearl felt the sting of his condescension, but she also felt a pull she couldn't explain. A smithy. It was the only world she had ever known. "I'll take it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Croft's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, quickly replaced by a look of predatory glee. He had expected her to be shamed, to slink away. He hadn't expected her to call his bluff. He quickly drew up the bill of sale, his pen scratching across the paper with finality. Pearl counted out $2 and pushed them across the desk. The coins looked small and insignificant on the vast, polished wood. As she took the deed, his smile returned, dripping with scorn. "Good luck to you, Miss Aldridge," he said, the title feeling like another jab. "You'll need it." As she walked out, the deed clutched in her hand. She could hear his low chuckle following her into the dusty street. She had a home, or at least she had the ghost of one. What was she thinking? Buying a place sight unseen. Why a forge of all things? A place of sweat and fire and back-breaking labor meant for a man twice her size. And what secret could possibly lie waiting in a place so thoroughly abandoned that it was worth less than a decent meal? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as Pearl held the key to her future, the town of Red Pine prepared to make her regret it. The news of the transaction spread through Red Pine like a grass fire. By the time Pearl had spent another $1 on a sack of flour and a slab of salt pork at the general store, it seemed everyone knew. The purchase of the old forge was seen not as a desperate act of survival, but as the height of feminine folly. In the saloon that evening, Silas Croft held court, recounting the tale with theatrical embellishments. "A slip of a girl, no older than 19, he boomed, his voice carrying over the low thrum of conversation. "Walks in with eyes bigger than her purse and buys that scrap heap. $2. I'd have paid her to haul it away." The men around him roared with laughter, the sound sharp and cruel. They were hard men in a hard country, and they had little patience for what they perceived as weakness or stupidity. A woman trying to run a forge was a joke. A girl buying a cursed one was a tragedy they found deeply amusing. From that moment on, Pearl was no longer just a stranger. She was the town fool, a walking cautionary tale. As she walked the edge of town, seeking the path to her new property, the scorn was a palpable thing. Women pulled their children closer as she passed. Men tipped their hats with exaggerated, mocking courtesy. Whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. "Thinks she's a blacksmith. Lost her mind, that one." Croft played her like a fiddle. Pearl kept her eyes fixed forward, her chin held high. The humiliation was a hot coal in her stomach, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her father had taught her that the true measure of a person wasn't how they acted in triumph, but how they bore their burdens in silence. She would bear this. As she paused by a trough to let her newly acquired mule, a sway-backed old creature named Gideon, she'd bought for $3, have a drink. An old woman sitting on a nearby bench caught her eye. She was Paiute, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She had watched Pearl's progress through the town without judgment. As Pearl met her gaze, the woman spoke, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. Some iron remembers the fire that made it, she said. The words were simple, yet they landed with a strange weight. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned her gaze back toward the mountains. Pearl didn't understand what she meant, not then. But the sentence lodged itself in her mind, a smooth, cool stone in the churning river of her anxiety. It felt less like a warning and more like a key, though she had no idea what lock it might fit. She tugged gently on Gideon's lead and continued on her way, the laughter of the town fading behind her, the old woman's cryptic words echoing in the sudden quiet. The path to the old forge was less a road and more a suggestion, a pair of faint ruts, overgrown with sagebrush and brittle weeds. It wound away from the relative order of red pine and into the scrubby, rock-strewn land that bled into the foothills. With Gideon plodding patiently behind her, Pearl followed the track, the deed clutched in her hand like a prayer. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and soft violet. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper, broken only by the crunch of her worn boots on the dry earth and the sigh of the wind through the sparse pines. The forge was situated in a small, shallow basin set against a low bluff of red rock. It looked as if the land itself had tried to swallow it. From a distance, it was a dark, hunched shape, a wound on the landscape. As she drew closer, the full extent of its dereliction became brutally clear. It was worse, far worse, than she had imagined. The main roof of the workshop sagged in the middle, a great sway-backed beast on the verge of collapse. Half the shingles were gone, leaving the ribs of the structure exposed to the sky. The windows were gaping mouths filled with shattered glass, and the large double doors to the main workspace hung crookedly from broken hinges. A shroud of rust covered every piece of exposed metal, from the hinges to the rain barrel, to the discarded horseshoes littering the ground. The place didn't just look abandoned, it looked defeated. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The town's laughter echoed in her ears. They were right. She was a fool. This wasn't a home. It was a tombstone marking the grave of a failed enterprise. What had she done? Thrown away her last hopes on a pile of rotting wood and rusted iron. For a long moment, she just stood there, the enormity of her mistake pressing down on her. The last of the sun's light caught on a shard of broken glass, making it glitter like a false diamond. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. She had never felt so alone. Her father's face flashed in her memory, his strong hands, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal that always clung to him. He had built his life from nothing, with nothing but his skill and his will. He would not have given up. He would have seen the work that needed to be done, and he would have started. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Pearl tethered Gideon to a withered post oak. She wouldn't sleep inside tonight. The structure didn't look safe. Instead, she unrolled her thin bedroll on a patch of clear ground nearby, where she could watch the ruin of her new home. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the black sky. The forge groaned and creaked in the night wind, speaking a language of decay. She lay there, listening to its sad old voice, and felt a strange kinship with the broken-down building. They were two of a kind, discarded, weathered, and facing an uncertain dawn. The next morning, Pearl awoke to a world washed in the clean, pale light of dawn. The air was cold enough to make her breath mist, but the chill seemed to cut through the fog of her despair. She was stiff, hungry, and daunted, but she was not broken. She rose, ate a dry piece of bread, and looked at the forge. In the morning light, it looked less like a tomb and more like a challenge. Fueled by a stubbornness she inherited directly from her father, she decided to begin. She would not be beaten by splintered wood and rust. She started with the doors. They were too heavy to lift back onto their hinges alone, so she wrestled them shut as best she could and wedged them closed with a fallen roof beam, securing the entrance. She found a small, less damaged side door and forced it open with her shoulder. the shriek of rusted hinges echoing in the cavernous space. Light struggled to pierce the gloom, filtering through the grimy windows and the holes in the roof in dusty, ethereal shafts. The inside was a disaster. Everything was coated in a thick, greasy layer of dust, soot, and cobwebs. Old tools, rusted beyond recognition, lay scattered on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of damp rot and cold ashes. In the center of the room, like a pagan altar in a forgotten temple, stood the anvil. It was immense, a classic London pattern anvil, its hardened steel face pitted and scarred from years of use and neglect. It rested on a massive cast-iron base, a thick, ornate stump that was bolted to the floor. It was the heart of the forge, the one indispensable tool. Without it, the place was just a shed. Pearl walked toward it, her boots crunching on debris. She ran a hand over its surface, feeling the cold, rough texture of the metal. It was a beautiful piece of work, despite the abuse it had suffered. This was the kind of anvil her father had always dreamed of owning. As a shaft of sunlight broke through a grimy pane of glass and fell directly upon the anvil's base, something caught her eye. It was a line, almost invisible, running down the side of the heavy cast-iron stump. A seam. It was perfectly straight, too clean to be a crack from damage or a flaw in the casting. Blacksmiths' anvils, especially their bases, were typically cast in a single, solid piece for stability. A seam made no sense. Curious, she knelt for a closer look. She traced the line with her finger. It was deliberate. Then, she did what any smith would do to test a piece of iron. She picked up a small, discarded ball-peen hammer from the floor and tapped the base. Instead of the high, solid ring of solid cast iron, the sound was a dull, muted thud, a dead sound. It was the sound of something hollow, or something filled with a softer, sound-dampening material. She tapped it again, higher up. Thud. Then she tapped the horn of the anvil itself. Ping. The clear, bell-like tone she expected. The contrast was jarring. Something was wrong with the anvil. She tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was a strange old design she'd never seen before. A cheap imitation. But the quality of the anvil's face and horn suggested otherwise. It was a contradiction. A fine tool on a flawed or fake base. The detail lodged itself in her mind. A small, insistent question mark in the overwhelming chaos of the ruined forge. She had 1,000 more pressing tasks, but the dead sound of the anvil echoed long after the hammer was silent. Days turned into a week. Pearl's life fell into a rhythm of relentless, grueling labor. She rose with the sun and worked until her muscles screamed and the light failed. Her silent companion in this endeavor was Gideon, the old mule who would stand tethered just outside. His patient presence a quiet comfort. He would watch her with his dark, liquid eyes, occasionally letting out a soft, breathy snort as if in encouragement. Pearl began with the most critical task, the roof. She scavenged fallen timbers and usable shingles, learning to climb the precarious frame with a sureness that belied her fear. She patched the largest holes, creating a space that was, if not dry, at least drier. Her hands, already calloused from her life at her father's side, became tougher, mapped with new cuts and splinters. She swept out years of accumulated filth, the dust rising in thick clouds that choked her and coated her from head to toe. She unearthed the hearth, a great brick structure choked with ancient, solidified soot and debris. She shoveled it out by the bucketful, her arms and back aching with the strain. Slowly, painstakingly, the forge began to resemble a place of work again, rather than a place of decay. Throughout this labor, the anvil remained at the center of her world. It was too heavy to move, a silent, immovable monolith. Every task seemed to bring her back to it. She would clear the space around it, stack salvaged tools near it, and often, at the end of the day, sit on a nearby crate and stare at it as she ate her meager meal of bread and dried meat. The more she worked in its presence, the more the initial anomaly of the dead-sounding bass bothered her. It was a dissonant note in the song of the smithy she was trying to revive. She remembered her father's teachings. Listen to the metal, Pearl, he would say, his voice gentle over the roar of the fire. It tells you what it needs. It tells you what it is. She had spent her life listening to iron, learning its language of heat, stress, and sound. And this anvil was telling her a story she didn't understand. One afternoon, while trying to clear the floor around its base, she found that the massive bolts holding it down were not as secure as they appeared. One was loose, its threads stripped. Another was sheared off entirely. It was anchored but poorly. It was almost as if it had been set in place hastily by someone who didn't know or didn't care about the proper way to seat an anvil for heavy work. A true smith would never be so careless. The anvil was the soul of the shop. Its stability was paramount. This carelessness, combined with the hollow sound and the strange seam, began to form a disturbing hypothesis in her mind. This anvil wasn't just a tool. It was a container. The thought was absurd, but it refused to be dismissed. It clung to her as she worked, a persistent whisper beneath the sounds of her labor. The suspicion became an obsession. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, Pearl decided she could ignore it no longer. The forge was tidier now, the floor mostly cleared. It was time to solve the riddle of the anvil. She lit a single lantern, its golden light pushing back the deep shadows of the workshop and casting her own long, dancing silhouette against the wall. She approached the anvil not as a smith, but as an investigator. With the lantern held close, she knelt and examined the seam on the base once more. This time, she wasn't just looking, she was searching. Her fingers, now sensitive to the slightest imperfection in metal, traced the line, feeling for a catch, a latch, a hidden spring. Her father had been a master of mechanical puzzles, creating intricate locks and trick boxes in his spare time. He had taught her to see how things fit together, to look for the maker's hidden mark. And she found it. Tucked away within the ornate cast-iron scrollwork at the bottom of the base was a tiny, almost imperceptible nub of metal. It looked like a casting flaw, a drip of excess iron, but when she pushed it, it moved. There was a faint, grinding click from within the base. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Using the flat edge of a cold chisel as a lever, she inserted the tip into the seam near the bottom and pried. The metal groaned in protest. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, scraping shriek, a section of the heavy cast-iron base swung outward on a hidden hinge. It was a door, brilliantly concealed, its weight and design making it nearly undetectable. She peered into the dark cavity, the lantern light trembling in her hand. The hollow chamber was not empty. It was filled almost to the top with a lumpy, misshapen mass of cool, dark metal. Her first thought was lead, or perhaps pewter scrap, saved for casting into weights or bullets. It seemed a strange thing to hide so carefully. She reached in and touched the surface. It was heavy, far heavier than lead. She scraped at it with the corner of the chisel. Where she scratched the dark, sooty surface, a deeper color gleamed in the lantern light. A soft, rich, unmistakable yellow, gold. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a solid mass of it, melted down from coin or bullion, and poured into the anvil base to cool. A fortune. As her eyes adjusted to the dark space, she saw something else, tucked into a small crevice beside the solid gold mass. It was a small package, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. Her fingers trembling, she retrieved it. She unwrapped the layers of preserved skin. Inside, nestled on a bed of old wool, was a small, heavy cylinder of hardened steel. She held it up to the light. One end was intricately carved with the face of liberty, the other with the heraldic eagle of a United States dollar coin. It was a die stamp, a masterfully crafted, perfect die for minting currency. It was also, she knew with chilling certainty, completely illegal. It was a counterfeiter's die. Just as the weight of her discovery settled upon her, the world outside began to change. The wind, which had been a constant sigh around the forge, rose to a mournful howl. The sky, visible through the patched roof, had turned a bruised, ominous gray. A storm was coming. Not a simple prairie squall, but a real teeth-bared blizzard. The kind that could descend on the high desert with shocking speed, even in the late autumn. The temperature plummeted. The first flakes of snow, thick and wet, began to fall, melting against the grimy windows before quickly starting to stick. Pearl hurriedly closed the hidden compartment in the anvil base, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a note of finality. The gold and the dye were hidden again, but their presence filled the small workshop with a dangerous energy. She had no time to process her discovery. Survival was now the only priority. She stuffed rags into the cracks around the doors and windows, trying to fend off the biting wind. She piled her remaining wood near the hearth, knowing the fire would be her lifeline. The storm hit with full fury. Snow fell in a blinding horizontal sheet, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. The old forge groaned and shuddered under the assault, and Pearl felt a primal fear she hadn't known since she was a small child. Hours passed. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of white. The forge, once her prison of shame, had become her fortress. Huddled by the hearth, the fire casting a warm, protective glow, she listened to the storm's rage. It was in the midst of this tempest that she heard a new sound, a desperate shouting, nearly lost in the gale. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a faint, bobbing light. A lantern, a wagon, its shape nearly obscured by the snow, had foundered not 50 yards from her forge, one of its wheels shattered in a deep rut. Through the blizzard, she could make out figures, a man struggling against the wind, and another shape huddled in the wagon. Without a second thought for her own safety, Pearl grabbed her own lantern, wrapped her thin coat tighter, and plunged into the storm. The wind tore at her, the snow stinging her face. She fought her way to the wagon. Inside was a young man, his face etched with panic, and his wife, pale and obviously pregnant, wrapped in a threadbare blanket alongside a small, shivering child. "Our axle broke," the man yelled over the wind. "We were headed for the pass. The rancher down the way, a Mr. Croft, he turned us out. Said he had no room." Pearl's jaw tightened at the mention of Silas Croft's name. "Come with me," she commanded, her voice strong against the storm. "There's shelter. It's not much, but it's warm." She helped the man guide his wife and child through the blinding snow, back to the fragile safety of the forge. She sat them by the fire, sharing her meager broth and blankets. As the storm raged outside, the old, forgotten blacksmith's shop, purchased for $2 in scorn, became a sanctuary. In that moment, protecting this family, Pearl made a silent choice. The gold in the anvil was a secret, a danger, but the forge itself, this place she had rebuilt with her own hands, was a home, and she would defend it. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, muffling all sound and reflecting the bright, cold sunlight. The young family, whose names were John and Mary, were weak but safe. Their gratitude toward Pearl was immense and humbling. As soon as the drifts were passable, John made his way into Red Pine to seek help and parts to repair his wagon. The story he told was not about his misfortune, but about his rescue. He spoke of the girl in the old forge, the one the town had laughed at, who had taken his family in from a blizzard that would have surely killed them, giving them her own food and warmth when the wealthiest man in the valley had turned them away. The story rippled through the community, planting the first seeds of doubt about their collective judgment. At the same time, another stranger arrived in town, a man whose presence caused a different kind of stir. He was a United States Marshal named Elias Vance, a tall, quiet man with weary eyes that missed nothing. He had been tracking a sophisticated counterfeit currency operation for months, a trail of false silver dollars that had poisoned the economy of the entire territory. The trail, he announced in the saloon, had gone cold right here in Red Pine. Pearl heard of the marshal's arrival from John when he returned with a borrowed wheel. She knew she could not keep her secret. The gold was a temptation, but the die stamp was a crime. It was a poison, just like the counterfeit coins, and it was sitting in the heart of her home. Her father had taught her that a smith's work must be true. The metal must be honest, the welds strong, the purpose clear. To keep the die, to benefit from a crime, would be a betrayal of everything he had stood for. That afternoon she walked into town, her face clean, her shoulders straight, and went directly to the hotel where the marshal was staying. She found him in the lobby and, in a low, steady voice, told him she had something he needed to see. Marshal Vance, intrigued by her earnestness, followed her back to the forge. In the quiet, sunlit workshop, she knelt and opened the hidden compartment of the anvil. The marshal's eyes widened, first at the sheer mass of gold, then at the small, deadly object she placed in his hand. He examined the die stamp, comparing it with a coin from his own pocket. "This is it," he murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "This is the source." He looked around the forge, then at Pearl. He realized the former smith, the man who had supposedly drunk himself to death, was the counterfeiter. And his sudden death 5 years ago was likely not an accident, but a silencing. The marshal's gaze grew sharp. Who was this Smith's closest associate in town, he asked. Pearl didn't have to answer. Everyone in Red Pine knew the man who had grown suddenly, inexplicably wealthy around the time the old Smith died. The man who had a reputation for cutting corners and associating with unsavory characters. The man who had sold Pearl the forge for a laugh, Silas Croft. The town's laughter had ceased entirely. It was replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The vindication was not loud, but it was absolute. Marshal Vance didn't arrest Silas Croft on the spot. There wasn't enough direct proof to tie him to the old Smith's murder, but the investigation he launched was swift and thorough. He impounded Croft's ledgers, questioned his associates, and put a microscope to his finances. The counterfeit die, found on property Croft had so smugly sold, cast a long, dark shadow from which he could not escape. His bluster evaporated, replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. The men who had laughed with him in the saloon now avoided his gaze. His empire of reputation, built on arrogance and ill-gotten gains, crumbled into dust. The community, in its quiet frontier way, passed its own sentence. Doors closed to him. Credit dried up. His mockery of Pearl had become his own downfall. The townspeople now looked at Pearl with a mixture of awe and shame. They had seen her as a fool, a fragile girl playing with a man's tools. They saw her now as she was, a woman of quiet strength, unshakable integrity, and a skill that ran deeper than muscle. She had faced down a blizzard, saved a family, and uncovered a crime that had been festering in their midst for years. The gold, a fortune that could have changed her life, was confiscated as federal evidence. Pearl was given a modest official reward for her role in the recovery, enough to live on for a year and properly outfit her forge, but not enough to make her rich. She didn't mind. The gold had been a burden. Her true reward was the forge itself. It was hers, truly hers now, earned not just with $2 but with sweat, faith, and moral clarity. People started coming to her, not with mockery, but with work. A farmer needed a plowshare mended. A rancher needed a custom branding iron. The livery needed a steady supply of horseshoes. They came to her forge, and they found not just a smith but an artisan. Her work was clean, strong, and honest, just like her father's had been. She became a fixture in the life of Red Pine, her presence as steady and essential as the anvil that stood in the center of her workshop. The forge was no longer a place of failure, but a symbol of resilience, its rhythmic heartbeat of hammer on iron, a new pulse for the town. One evening, as the sun set and cast long, golden rays of light through the open doors of the forge, John, the man she had rescued from the storm, came to see her. His wagon was repaired, and his family was ready to continue their journey west. His wife, Mary, had given birth to a healthy baby boy in town, and they had named him Aldridge in her honor. John stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a humble gratitude in his eyes that was worth more to Pearl than all the gold in the world. He looked around the clean, orderly workshop, at the tools hanging in their proper places, at the warm glow of the banked fire in the hearth. "It's amazing what you've made of this place," he said softly. "After all that, after everything you went through, what was it you really found in here, Miss Aldridge?" Pearl looked away from him, toward the great anvil that had been the source of so much turmoil and ultimately so much truth. She laid a hand on its scarred, steady surface, the metal still warm from the day's work. She thought of her father, of the town's scorn, of the hidden gold, and of the family she saved. A small, serene smile touched her lips. "Just a place to make something true," she said. "Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a powerful reminder that our real worth isn't found, but forged." If you were moved by Pearl's journey, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor the strength of the human spirit. We'll see you next time.